The dress they gave her had belonged to a scullery maid who had left the previous winter without collecting it. It was clean, which was something, and it fit across the shoulders, which was something else, and it was the kind of gray that gray becomes when it has been washed too many times and has given up pretending to be a color. Sylvie Beaumont-Hale stood in the servants' entrance of Thornfield Manor, her mother's house, her grandmother's house, the house that had been in her family for 4 generations, before her uncle had decided, while her father's body was still being prepared for burial, that the paperwork could be arranged differently, and thought that her stepmother had been right about one thing. She had said, the morning they put Sylvie out, that she would come to understand her place eventually. She had not meant it as encouragement. But Sylvie had understood, standing in the gray dress with her small bag and her composure and the thing she was not going to say in front of anyone who might repeat it, that place was exactly what she intended to come back for. She had given them a false name at the agency. Sylvie March, which was her mother's maiden name, stretched sideways into something unrecognizable. The reference letter had been written by a solicitor's clerk in Dorchester, who was the nephew of her father's old solicitor, and who had looked at her across a narrow desk and said he would not ask questions if she would not make him regret it. She had said she wouldn't. She intended to keep that promise as long as she could. The housekeeper at Thornfield Manor was a woman named Mrs. Keene, who had silver hair and a manner that suggested she had seen most things and found very few of them surprising. She looked at Sylvie in the servants' entrance with the particular attention of a woman taking stock, not unfriendly but thorough, the way you look at something you are deciding where to put. "Miss March," she said, "you come with a reference for household management and for accounts." She did. "We do not ordinarily take on women for accounts work." Mrs. Keene's tone was not apologetic. "We have taken on many things this year that we do not ordinarily do. His Grace has been back at Thornfield for 3 months after 7 years abroad, and the house requires a great deal of catching up with itself." Sylvie nodded. She knew the Duke of Thornfield had been abroad. She had been waiting for him to come home. "The position is household assistant," Mrs. Keene said. "You will manage correspondence relating to the domestic accounts, assist with the inventory of the east and west wings, which have not been opened since the late Duchess passed, and report to me in all matters. You will not trouble His Grace. You will not enter the library without His Grace's permission. And you will not," she added, with the precision of someone who had learned to say certain things specifically because they had not always been obvious, "speak to any member of the household about the family's private affairs." "I understand," Sylvie said. She was given a room on the 3rd floor, small, clean, south-facing. The window looked out over the kitchen garden and, beyond it, the east wing. She stood at the window for a moment before she unpacked, looking at the roofline she knew as well as the shape of her own hands, and thought about the word inventory. Someone had to do it. Someone had to open those rooms and make a list of what was there. She had not planned this precisely. She had planned it well enough. She had been at Thornfield 3 weeks when she saw him. She had managed in those 3 weeks to be useful without being visible, which was a skill she had developed in the 2 years since her father's death with the thoroughness of someone who has had no alternative. She had reorganized the household accounts into a system that Mrs. Keene described as considerably more sensible than what we had before, which Sylvie accepted as the highest register of praise the woman used. She had begun the inventory of the East Wing, which she had been assigned to work through methodically, 1 room at a time, and which required her most mornings to stand in a doorway and look at her family's things, and then write them down on a ledger page as though she had never seen them before. She had been doing this for 11 days when she found the portrait. It was not where portraits were typically hung. Most of Thornfield's formal portraits occupied the main gallery on the first floor, arranged in chronological order, with the particular self-consciousness of a family that had been important long enough to document itself. This one was in the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, the room her mother had used for correspondence, and it was hanging behind a curtain that someone had drawn across it at some point and not drawn back. She pushed the curtain aside and stopped. Her mother, at perhaps 30, painted in the manner of 20 years past, the high waist, the simple dress, the light from a window that wasn't in the frame. Her mother had been dark-haired and serious in the way that some people are serious, not without warmth, but with the specific quality of someone who does not perform feeling for an audience. The painter had caught something that the formal portraits on the first floor had entirely missed. A slight turn of the head, as though she had just heard something worth attending to, and a mouth that was deciding whether to speak. Sylvie stood in front of the curtained portrait in the east corridor and breathed carefully until the tightening in her throat passed. Then she looked at the small brass plate on the lower edge of the frame. Catherine Beaumont, it read, 1893. Not Catherine Beaumont-Hale. Not her mother's married name. Her mother as she had been before the marriage, before Sylvie, before the house had changed hands twice and the paperwork had been arranged differently. Someone had painted her mother as a young woman and put her in this room behind a curtain, and that someone was not anyone Sylvie's uncle would have commissioned. She wrote in the ledger, one portrait, oil on canvas, small frame, east corridor sitting room. Subject identified as C. Beaumont. Condition good. She did not write the rest of what she was thinking. She had learned to keep the rest of what she was thinking for rooms she was alone in. She saw the Duke that afternoon. She had not been told he would be in the East Wing. Mrs. Keene had given her to understand that His Grace did not often come this way, which was why the rooms had fallen into such useful neglect. She was coming out of the corridor with her ledger when he came around the corner at the far end, moving with the particular directness of a man who had a destination rather than a purpose. And they both stopped. The Duke of Thornfield was not what she had expected, and she had been expecting him for 2 years, which meant she had constructed a thorough and likely inaccurate version of him in her mind, and was now adjusting. He was taller than she'd imagined. He had the kind of face that required looking at twice, not dramatic in the way of portraits, but specific in the way of people, all the features working together to produce something that was less about handsomeness and more about presence. He was perhaps 35. He had been 7 years abroad. She didn't know precisely why. He looked at her, then at the ledger, then at her. "You're the new household assistant," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, Miss March." He looked at her for a moment in the way that made her feel her false name like a garment that didn't quite fit right, not that he suspected anything, but that he was the kind of person who paid attention to things, and she was going to have to remember that. "The East Wing," he said, looking past her at the open doorway. "How far have you got?" "Through the first 4 rooms, Your Grace." "I've been working west to east." He was quiet for a moment. "How are the rooms?" She chose her words, well maintained for rooms that have been closed some time. "The furnishings are in good condition. There are some items that appear personal rather than household, which I have listed separately." "Personal," he said, in a tone she couldn't quite read. "Correspondence. Some clothing, a portrait, something moved across his face. Not quite an expression, but the place an expression had recently been." "The portrait is accounted for," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at her again for a moment. "Carry on," he said, and moved past her down the corridor with the stride of a man going somewhere he had been meaning to go for some time. She stood very still and listened to his footsteps stop at the end of the corridor. in front of the curtained portrait and did not turn around. She ate in the servants' hall that evening and said nothing about it to anyone, which was not unusual. She had been careful about what she said and didn't say in 3 weeks, careful enough that the other staff had decided she was quiet rather than secretive and treated her accordingly, which was exactly what she had wanted. The cook, a woman named Mrs. Garth, had decided she was sensible and given her the best seat near the fire. The underfootman, a young man named Robin, had decided she was interesting in the politely baffling way of someone who reads books without explaining themselves. Mrs. Keene had decided she was competent, which was the version that mattered. She had not decided anything about the Duke yet. She was still watching. He came to the East Wing again 2 days later. This time she heard him first, footsteps she was beginning to learn, and had time to straighten her ledger before he appeared in the doorway of the room she was working in. This room had been her mother's bedroom. The furniture was still there, slightly sheeted, the dressing table still laid with her mother's things under the dust cloths. Sylvie had opened the curtains that morning to work by natural light and regretted and not regretted it in equal measure. The room looked, in November daylight, like a room still waiting for its occupant to come back. The Duke stood in the doorway and looked at the room and then at her, and she had the specific unpleasant sensation of someone standing in a situation she had planned for, and finding that the plan had not accounted for how it would feel. "You've opened it up," he said. "The light is better for cataloguing." He came into the room, which she had not expected. He stood near the dressing table and looked at the sheeted objects with an expression that was more controlled than blank, the look of someone deciding what they were going to feel before they felt it. "Did you know her?" Sylvie asked, and then caught herself because she had said her, and not the previous resident or the owner of these effects or anything that a household assistant who was cataloging an East Wing she had never been in before would say. He looked at her. "I knew her family," he said carefully, watching her the way he had watched her in the corridor, that focused, deliberate attention. And then, because she was standing in this room with a ledger she had been filling with the details of her mother's belongings, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man confirming something he had begun to suspect, he said, "How long have you been here, Miss March?" 3 weeks, Your Grace." He was quiet. "Before that?" She met his eyes. "Before that," she said, "I was in Bristol." "Bristol," he said in the tone of a man who knew Bristol was not the answer to the question he had asked. She said nothing. She held her ledger and looked at him, and did not look away, which she had the sense was either the right decision or the worst one she had made in some time. He crossed to the window, looked out at the kitchen garden and the grounds beyond. The afternoon light was going. The East Wing had a particular quality in late afternoon, long shadows from the old trees, the kind of light that made rooms feel like they had always looked like this. "There was a woman," he said, "who came to Thornfield when I was about 14. She was a friend of my mother's, I understood, though my mother was not someone who used the word friend lightly, which meant the woman was something more specific than that." Sylvie was very still. "She visited twice," he said. "The second time she brought a child with her, a small girl, dark-haired, serious." He paused. "She sat under my father's desk during a thunderstorm because she had decided it was the most structurally sound piece of furniture in the library. She had not remembered that. She had been 6. She had not known he was watching." He turned from the window. "The child's name," he said, "was Sylvie, not March." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the November trees. Somewhere below them in the house, someone was closing doors. She could say anything now. She could maintain the position she had held for 3 weeks, the careful distance, the false name, the ledger between herself and everything she had actually come here for. She had planned for this conversation in the abstract, had rehearsed versions of it at night in her third-floor room, and none of the versions had included him already knowing. "Beaumont-Hale," she said. "Sylvie Beaumont-Hale." He nodded once as though she had confirmed something he had been waiting to have confirmed. Then he said, simply and without accusation, "How long were you going to wait?" She let out a breath, "Until I understood what I was looking for." "And do you?" he said. "Understand it?" She looked at the room, her mother's room, quiet and sheeted and waiting, in a house that was also hers and also not, depending on which version of the documents you looked at. "Mostly," she said. "Not entirely." He pulled the sheet from the nearest chair, folded it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had not been raised to consider that someone else would do it, and sat down. "Then sit down," he said, "and tell me what you know, and I will tell you what I know, and perhaps between us we will arrive at the rest of it." She sat. Her father had died in the autumn 2 years ago, she told him, not suddenly, which was both worse and better than sudden in the ways that slow loss always was. She had been with him at the end, had sat with him through the last 3 weeks of it, had held his hand and read to him and been there when it was over. She had not been permitted at the reading of the will. Her uncle, her father's younger brother, had told her it was not necessary, that these were business matters, that she ought to rest, that she had been through so much already. The solicitor who had managed the estate had been replaced in the final months of her father's illness with a different one. She had not known this at the time. She had learned it 4 months later when she had tried to contact the original solicitor and found that he had moved his practice to Glasgow, and that the solicitor currently managing Beaumont-Hale affairs was a man she did not know in an office she had never been to, and that when she wrote to inquire about the terms of her father's will, the letter she received in return was coarse brief and told her nothing specific. She had been given a modest allowance and a room in her uncle's house and an understanding that things had been arranged. She had spent 6 months arranging to understand. What things? The Duke of Thornfield listened to this the way he listened to most things, completely, without interrupting, with the focused quality of someone who considers listening a serious activity rather than a pause between speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father and mine," he said, "were at school together. I don't know if you knew that." She hadn't. "They maintained a correspondence until my father died." He paused. "I was 7 when I lost him. I don't have clear memories of their friendship, but I have the letters, and when I came back to Thornfield in the spring, I went through them properly for the first time." He looked at the sheeted furniture, the dressing table, the closed wardrobe. "It was apparent to me reading them that your father trusted mine with something specific." "What?" she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a letter, not new, folded and refolded enough that the creases were worn. He set it on the table between them. She picked it up. "Read it." It was her father's handwriting. She recognized it the way you recognize something you have not seen in 2 years, but have been carrying the shape of the particular angle of the letters, the habit of crossing certain letters twice that she had thought was only his. He wrote, in the measured language of a man putting things in order, "I am not confident that the arrangements I have made will be honored. I have made them correctly, and I have signed them in front of witnesses, and I believe they are sound. But I have known my brother for 40 years, and I know what he considers, when there is something worth considering, and I want someone outside of all of that to know what I intended, not what is eventually produced and called my intention." She read the rest of it. She read it twice. She set it down. "He put it with you," she said, "for safekeeping. I found it with the correspondence when I came home this spring," he said. "I began making inquiries. I wrote to 3 solicitors in Dorset before I found someone willing to speak plainly. "The solicitor in Dorchester," she said, "his clerk." He had the courtesy not to look satisfied about it. He had, she was understanding, the particular quality of a careful man who had arrived at conclusions before the conversation them, and who did not need to perform the arrival, and who did not need to perform the arrival. "You knew I was here," she said. "I knew someone called Sylvie March had taken a position in my household and had not asked about the East Wing in her inquiry, but had listed primary qualification," he said. "I drew conclusions. You let me come. I thought it was better for you to arrive," he said, "than to be summoned. There is a difference." She looked at him across the table in her mother's room in the house that was hers and not hers, and thought about 2 years of careful arrangement, the false name, the agency, the clerk in Dorchester, the gray dress, and the entry in the ledger she had written that morning. One portrait, East Corridor. Subject identified, condition good. She thought about being 6 years old under a desk during a thunderstorm and not knowing that anyone had seen her. "What does my father's letter say?" she said. "The part that matters." He looked at her steadily. "That you are not to be settled with a reduced allowance in someone else's house," he said. "That there is a trust your uncle was not made aware of, because your father made it separately and quietly through a different solicitor 18 months before he died. And that Thornfield Manor," he said, and his voice was even, the voice of a man who had decided to say something and was saying it correctly, "was always intended to be yours. Through your mother's family. It was promised in a settlement your parents signed before their marriage. Your uncle could not have legitimately sold it or held it in trust for himself. He knew that. The solicitor he replaced knew that. And they chose to proceed as though they didn't. She had known. She had known most of it, or suspected it, which was not the same as hearing it said plainly by a person who had the documents to back it. Hearing it said plainly was a different thing. She sat with it for a moment. Her throat tightened. She did not look away. "My uncle," she said, "has been collecting the rents on a property that belongs to me. For 2 years, yes, and the trust, intact. He was not aware of it. Your father was careful." She nodded once, slowly. She looked at the sheeted room, the draped dressing table, the curtains she had opened for the light, the portrait at the end of the corridor with the brass plate that said her mother's name. She asked her mother's family for safekeeping, she said. The portrait. "My mother kept it," he said. "She said in a letter I found that it seemed wrong, for it to be somewhere your mother couldn't be seen properly." He paused. She was not wrong. She could not say precisely, when she had decided that the Duke of Thornfield was someone her father had trusted for good reasons. It was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of them. The letter produced without preamble, the chair uncovered without ceremony, the room sat in without performance, the specific, careful way he had allowed her to arrive, rather than summoning her. It was the fact that he had spent 6 months making inquiries about a woman whose name he'd only learned from an old letter and had not mentioned it until she was standing in her own family's rooms with a ledger and a false name. "Who else knows?" she said. "That I'm here, Mrs. Keene," he said. "I told her this morning." Sylvie thought about Mrs. Keene in the servants' entrance 3 weeks ago, the assessing look, the way she had accepted a reference for household accounts without asking more questions than necessary. "She knew already," Sylvie said. "But probably," he said. "Mrs. Keene has been at Thornfield for 26 years. She is not a woman who misses things." She almost smiled. She did not, quite. There would be time for that. "What happens now?" she said. He stood, went to the window again. Outside, the November garden was going to dusk, the kitchen beds bare, the old apple tree at the far wall leafless and entirely unbothered by any of this. "You have a solicitor in Dorchester," he said, "who is going to hear from mine before the end of the week. The trust your father established will be accessible to you within a matter of days once the correct parties are notified. The question of your uncle's management of the rents is a legal matter, and it will be treated as one." He paused. "The question of Thornfield itself is more specific. It is yours by settlement. It has also been my home for 3 months, and my family's home for considerably longer." She looked at him. "I am not suggesting," he said carefully, "that you are a guest here, because you are not. I am observing that the house has 2 people in it who have a claim to it by different instruments, and that seems to me worth discussing rather than assuming." She stood. She crossed to the window and stood beside him and looked out at the November garden, the bare beds, the apple tree, the long shadows from the east wing wall. "The trust," she said, "and the property settlement. Both documented, both provable. My uncle will contest it." "He will," Edmund said, "and encounter a great deal of resistance from the available evidence." She had not noticed, until he said her name, that she had stopped thinking of him as the Duke of Thornfield in the last quarter of an hour, and started thinking of him as Edmund, which was either a significant development or a symptom of the particular intimacy of being in a sheeted room with someone who was taking your side in something that had felt, for 2 years, entirely unsurvivable alone. He was looking at her with that expression she was learning to read, not soft exactly, but specific, the attention of someone who was not going to look away from what he was actually seeing. "He stood here," she said, "my father, in this room, many times. My mother wrote that he would sit at that desk for hours when he visited and write letters, that he then read to her, which she said she found amusing because they were letters about things he had already told her in conversation." He paused. She wrote that he did it because he found it clarifying, that he understood what he thought by writing it down. She looked at the covered desk. She had not touched it yet. She had been leaving it. "There's something in it," she said. Not a question. He reached into his jacket a second time and set a key on the windowsill between them. She picked it up. The desk key was small, old, warm from his pocket. She held it in her palm and looked out the window at the dusk, and thought about her father clarifying his thoughts by writing them down, in this room, in this house, to a woman who had painted her mother and put her on the wall and kept the portrait behind a curtain where it could not be lost. She thought about a gray dress and a false name and 3 weeks of inventory and the word place which her stepmother had used, and which had turned out to mean something entirely different from what her stepmother had intended. "I'll need a few days," she said. "Of course," he said. She closed her fingers around the key. She came down to dinner that evening. Mrs. Keene had set the small dining room rather than the formal one, which Sylvie understood without being told, as a signal that the category of things had shifted. She sat across from Edmund at a table that was not performing anything and ate a meal that was better than she deserved to taste, and found that the thing loosening in her chest was not going to stop doing so simply because she was not ready for it. He asked her questions, not about the legal situation, not about her uncle or the trust or the property settlement. He asked her what she had been reading in the 3 weeks she had been in the house. He asked her about Bristol, which turned out to be a city she had genuinely spent time in before all of this, and which he had passed through once on his way back from a port, and found more interesting than he'd expected. He asked her what she had thought of Garth's soup, which she said was excellent, and he said Mrs. Garth would be pleased to hear it, but would not be told, because compliments made her adjust her recipes in pursuit of even higher standards, and the kitchen could not sustain many more adjustments. She laughed, genuinely, the kind that arrived before she decided about it. He noticed. He said nothing about it, which was its own kind of noticing. The solicitor's letter arrived on Thursday. She was in the library when Mrs. Keene brought it to her, which was where she had been every morning, since Edmund had told her she was welcome to it at any hour, which he had said the morning after the East Wing, and which she had accepted with the specific gratitude of someone who has been without access to a proper library for years, and had not realized how much that costs you. The letter was from Mr. Alistair Vane, solicitor of Dorchester, who had found her father's original documents and was prepared to say so in any setting that required it. He named figures. He named provisions. He named the specific legal instruments that her uncle had not disclosed, and the specific ways in which non-disclosure of those instruments constituted something more serious than an She read it twice. She set it on the reading table. She sat in the library for a long time. Edmund came in at 10:30 with 2 cups of coffee, and the particular manner of someone who has been told by his housekeeper that Miss Beaumont-Hale has been in the library since 8 and has not asked for anything. He set a cup near her elbow and sat across the reading table without asking which was the relevant section. She read him the relevant section, not the full letter, just the part that named what her father had written and what her uncle had chosen not to mention. When she finished, he was quiet. Then he said, "Your father wrote that you were not to be managed or diminished." Those were his words, that you were to have the full measure of what he had built, which he had built, he wrote, with you specifically in mind. She looked at the window. November light, honest and low. 2 years, she said. Yes, she thought about the gray dress, the small room in her uncle's house that had a window facing a wall, the allowance that was enough to be technically sufficient and not enough to be anything else. The way her uncle had a habit, at family dinners, of explaining her situation to other people in her presence, as though she were not there to have opinions about her own circumstances. She had not cried in her uncle's house. She had made that decision in the first month and had kept it because crying would have been received as confirmation of something she refused to confirm. She did not cry now either, but it was a different kind of not crying, the kind that comes from things arriving rather than things being refused entrance. She is not to be managed or diminished, she said. He wrote that. He wrote more, Edmund said. I can have Price send the full section if you would like to read it in your father's words. Yes, she said, I would. He nodded. He reached across the table and turned her coffee cup toward her because she had been holding it at an angle and had apparently not noticed, and then sat back with his own and looked out the window. They sat like that for a while, not speaking. The library had the quality of a room that had been used for this kind of quiet before, the comfortable quiet of people who have said enough for the moment and are not filling it to be polite. She left the library to write to the solicitor in Dorchester. She wrote 2 letters, one to Mr. Vane, and one that she sat at the desk for a long time before beginning, to her uncle. She had written several versions of the latter in her head over the course of 2 years, and had imagined most of them landing with considerable force. The one she actually wrote was shorter than any of the imagined versions, and said only what was necessary, which she had come to understand was the only register that could not be argued with or reframed. She had come to understand a number of things. The letter to her uncle said, "You were aware of the settlement and the trust. You were aware of both before you made the arrangements you made. I am giving you the courtesy of knowing that I know this, and that I intend to proceed accordingly, and that the matter is now with legal representatives who are prepared to pursue it fully. Sylvie Beaumont-Hale." She folded it, sealed it, gave it to the footman to post. She felt, walking back through the corridor to the library, the specific and unmistakable feeling of a door closing behind her, not a dramatic one, not a door that slammed. The quiet click of something that had been open too long and had finally, with appropriate ceremony, been shut. Her uncle arrived on a Saturday. She had not expected him quite so quickly. She was in the east corridor with her ledger, which she had continued because the inventory was not going to complete itself, and because she found, unexpectedly, that she wanted the record. She wanted every item in that wing listed in her own handwriting in a ledger that would belong to the estate. Mrs. Keene came to find her. She said it with the tone of a woman who had already handled the first part of the situation. "Mr. Hartley Beaumont is in the entrance hall. He has not been invited to wait in any of the sitting rooms." Sylvie set down her ledger. She came down the stairs to find her uncle standing in the entrance hall with the posture of a man who had arrived at a place expecting to have authority and had discovered the geography was different than he remembered. He was 60, her uncle, and had the look of a man who had been managing things his whole life and was not accustomed to the specific sensation of finding things had been managed without him. He looked at her in her household dress, and then at the entrance hall, and then at her again. "Sylvie," he said, "I received your letter." "I thought you might," she said. "I think there has been some misunderstanding," he said in the tone of a man constructing the most plausible version of events as he spoke. "Your father's wishes were followed as closely as circumstances allowed. These legal matters are often more complicated than they appear, and I'm sure that if we discuss it sensibly, who tampered with the will?" she said. He stopped. She was not angry. That was the thing she noticed, standing in the entrance hall of her mother's house, looking at the man who had spent 2 years managing her. She was not performing calm either. She was simply, genuinely, on the other side of it, and the distance was sufficient. "I want to be clear," she said, "that I am not asking this because I don't know the answer. I am asking it because I want you to understand that I know, and that others know, and that the time for constructing sensible explanations has passed." The footman at the door was extraordinarily interested in the middle distance. She did not need to turn around to know that Edmund was somewhere behind her. She had heard him come into the entrance hall a moment after she had come downstairs, and he had not said anything, and she had not asked him to. His presence was neither intervention nor interference. It was simply the specific gravity of a person who is standing in a room on your side of something. Her uncle looked past her. His expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a man recalibrates what he thought the situation was. "I would suggest," Edmund said quietly from behind her, without heat, entirely composed, "that this is a conversation better suited to legal correspondence than a house call. Mr. Beaumont, my solicitor's name is Alderton, of Lincoln's Inn. He is expecting to hear from whoever advises you. I would recommend that you contact him this week." Her uncle stood in the entrance hall for a moment longer. Then he put his hat back on. He looked at Sylvie. He said, "Your father always said you were too much like your mother." He had meant it, she understood, as the kind of remark that was designed to land like a stone. He had used it before over the past 2 years in smaller ways. A comment at dinner, a look across a room, the specific inflection people use when they are trying to make something into a liability. She let it land. She let it be what it was. "Yes," she said. He did say that. She waited until her uncle had left, until the door had closed behind him, and the carriage had gone down the drive. And Mrs. Keene had looked at her with the small, particular satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting 26 years to see a certain sort of person leave this house. Then she turned. Edmund was at the foot of the stairs. He had his hands in his coat pockets and was looking at her with the expression she was coming to know, the way you come to know a piece of music you have heard enough times to anticipate. The expression that was not approval exactly because approval assumed a hierarchy she had stopped maintaining, but something underneath it. Something that had been building since a Thursday morning in an east corridor when he had let her carry a ledger into a room that was already hers. He said, "You were not too much like your mother." "No," she said. "You were exactly enough like her," he said. "It is a very different thing." She looked at the entrance hall, the stone floor, the November light through the tall windows, the house that had been waiting. "Your father always said that too, didn't he?" Edmund said. Yes, she looked at him. He always said exactly enough. She went upstairs. She went back to the east corridor and picked up her ledger from where she had left it on the hall table and continued the inventory, room by room, item by item, in the honest and detailed handwriting of someone recording things that are hers and always were. The legal proceedings took 4 months. Mr. Vane was thorough and the evidence was considerable, and her uncle's position deteriorated with the particular efficiency of a structure built on ground that had always been less stable than it appeared. She was present for none of the formal proceedings, which was by choice. She had given her account in writing, clearly and completely, and she trusted Vane to do the rest. She had enough else to be present for. She finished the inventory of the East Wing in December. She compiled it into a bound ledger that she left on Edmund's desk with a note that said, "Complete. The rooms are ready to be opened." She had not said which of them she intended to open herself because he would know. He was, she had discovered, someone who knew the things she didn't say. It was disorienting at first, and then gradually the opposite of disorienting. It was the specific relief of being in the presence of someone for whom you did not have to perform the effort of communication. She opened her mother's room on the Saturday before Christmas. She opened the curtains first, then the wardrobe, then the desk. The desk had 3 drawers, and in the bottom drawer, wrapped in paper that had dried to amber with age, was a bundle of letters in a handwriting she recognized before she saw the signature. Not her father's writing this time, her mother's. Letters to the previous Duchess of Thornfield. Letters covering 15 years, bundled by year, the same system the Duchess had used for the correspondence on the other side. Her mother and the Duchess had written to each other for 15 years. She had not known. She had known her mother had friends she did not speak of often, which had seemed like privacy rather than absence, and had turned out to be both. She sat on the floor of her mother's room with the bundle in her lap and read, until the light was gone, and she had to light the lamp, and then she read some more. Her mother had been, she discovered reading this evidence, extremely funny, sharp and precise, and occasionally devastating about the sort of people who deserved it, and warm in a way that did not need to announce itself about the people she loved. She went to find Edmund. He was in the library, which was where he could reliably be found at 9 in the evening, in the chair by the fire with a book, and the particular contentment of a man who had come back to a house after 7 years and discovered he had missed it more than he'd known. She sat in the opposite chair without asking because she no longer asked. She had a letter in her hand. She read him the paragraph about the neighboring landowner who had attempted to navigate a property dispute with such comprehensive incompetence that the dispute had expanded to include a third party who had not previously been involved and was now also aggrieved. It was 3 sentences long and contained one of the sharpest observations she had ever read in her life. Edmund listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have had something extremely specific to say about your uncle." "Yes," Sylvie said. "She would have said it once and not repeated herself, and it would have been enough." He looked at the fire. "My mother wrote that she was the most direct person she had ever corresponded with, and that she had found it completely restful." A pause. I understand what she meant now. She looked at him. "You mean me," she said. "Not my mother." "Both," he said. "It runs." She looked at the fire. Outside, the December wind was moving through the Thornfield oaks, the ones that had been standing long enough to be unbothered by weather. The house was warm in the way that old houses are warm when they are fully inhabited, when there are enough people in them going about their business to generate the particular warmth of occupation. She had not known 8 months ago, standing in her uncle's entrance hall with a bag she had packed herself, that this was where she was going. She had known she was going somewhere. She had known she was not finished. Spring arrived, as springs do, without announcement. The kitchen garden came back, the apple tree persuaded itself into blossom, and the east wing, fully opened now, with the curtains drawn back and the sheets removed, and the rooms aired and listed and catalogued, looked like what it was, a part of a house that had been waiting and was no longer waiting. The trust was accessible in February. She paid for the repairs to the kitchen garden wall herself, which Mrs. Garth received with the particular emotional restraint of a woman who considered any investment in her kitchen garden to be correct and expected. Her uncle did not contest the settlement in the end. Mr. Vane had written to tell her, in the dry tone of a man who found this unsurprising, that the available documentation had made contestation inadvisable. She had not responded with anything beyond an acknowledgement. She had said what she needed to say in the letter she'd sent in November and did not need to say it again. She had written to 3 people who had known her before. A school friend in Edinburgh who had been told she was not receiving visitors. A woman who had been her mother's dressmaker and had written once to ask after her, and received no reply because her uncle managed the correspondence, and the solicitor's clerk in Dorchester, to whom she wrote a letter that said only that he had been right to trust her, and that she intended to honor that, and that she hoped his nephew would continue to find the work rewarding. She received 3 replies. All of them were warmer than she felt she deserved for the 2 years of absence, and she sat with that warmth for a long time before she accepted it. It was April before Edmund said the thing he had apparently been deciding how to say since November. She knew he was deciding it the way she knew most things about him now, not because he showed it, but because she had learned the specific quality of his silence when it was working something through versus when it was simply at rest. They had been walking in the kitchen garden on a Tuesday afternoon, the blossom on the apple tree having committed fully to its seasonal assignment. When he stopped near the wall she had paid to repair and looked at it, and then at her and said, "I would like to ask you something." She looked at him. "I would like to ask it," he said, in the specific way that makes clear it is a question and not an arrangement, because you have had enough of arrangements. She understood what he was going to ask before he asked it. She understood it the way you understand something that has been becoming true for a long time and has finally arrived at the point of being said. He asked it. He asked it simply and without performance, in the 2 sentences that were accurate rather than the 20 that would have been insufficient, and looked at her while he waited. She looked at the apple tree, the garden wall, the house, pale stone in the April light, the east wing windows open, curtains moving slightly in the warm wind. She thought about a gray dress and a false name and a ledger full of her family's things described in her own handwriting. She thought about a key left on a windowsill. She thought about her mother's letters, 15 years of them, bundled by year in a locked drawer in a room that had been kept for her return. She thought about her father writing that he understood what he thought by writing it down. She thought about exactly enough. "Yes," she said. "Edmund, yes." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked back toward the house through the April garden, the blossom overhead, the wall repaired, the east wing open, the house fully inhabited. Mrs. Keene, who was watching from the kitchen window with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for 6 months, said nothing to anyone who was not already going to agree with her. The gray dress was never mentioned again, but in the bottom of the chest in Sylvie's room, carefully folded and not discarded, it stayed. She had been asked once by one of the younger maids, who was new and did not know better, why Miss Beaumont-Hale kept a gray cotton dress folded at the bottom of her wardrobe when she had perfectly good clothes. Mrs. Keene, who happened to be passing, answered, "Because," she said, "some things are worth remembering correctly." And in the east corridor, Her mother looked out from the undrawn portrait in the light of a house that was no longer waiting, with the expression of someone who had just heard something worth attending to, and a mouth that had finally, quietly, decided to speak.